So I will follow Lin's footstep to think concept by thinking through media. And so my concept today is war, and I will explore how war as media is conceptualized through the history of two Chinese words, Cheng, which means war city, and the Ping, which means war screen. And I'll explain these two words later. So why war? In today's geopolitical and cultural situation, it seems both ironic and utterly agent to talk about wars, especially in the recent pandemic of the COVID that is marked by the widespread experience of quarantine, lockdown, and the social distancing, which reinforced the war condition as a global norm. More than 2 decades after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we find ourselves surrounded by layers of walls, physical and virtual, real and fictional. And the current crisis in Ukraine probably tell us the Berlin Wall never fall or it's probably being rebuilt overnight. More importantly, walls increasingly have become the prevalent technological devices, metaphorical concepts on digital media network that is supposed to eliminate all boundaries. From computer firewalls to paywalls, from Facebook wall to China's Great Firewall, digital space is largely walled. The existence of these walls shattered the myths of what Manuel Castells famously called the space of flow, highlighted significant function of the wall as a key apparatus in managing, structuring, and framing information, knowledge, and experience. It problematized Enlightenment ideals of transparency, depth, openness, and universal knowledge, and underlined world mediation as a fundamental condition of modern experience, including this zoomed wall screen. The purpose of my project is to understand the meaning and the function of the wall as both a political concept and a media device by examining its material and its discursive formation as both objects and signs. I want to ask, where do these walls come from, for what purposes? What are their functions and significations? Basically, I want to study both archaeology of walls as a material device and the genealogy of the wall as a metaphorical concept. And we'll start from the metaphor. As a metaphorical concept, the wall is a radical challenge and the departure from the popular window metaphor that has a deep-rooted history from Alberti to Microsoft. If the window mediate by organizing our vision in relation to the physical space, the wall rather mediate our experience by organizing and differentiating the space itself, giving it orientation and meanings. While the window promises a transparent vision into infinite depths, the wall manages spatial environments with the borders and surfaces. The wall does represent alternative genealogy from the window in competing conception of a media system, shifting from optical apparatus to spatial devices, from the open grid of optical projection to the containing surface of spatial and environmental arrangement. Changing the metaphor from window to wall, I want to suggest a theoretical reconsideration of modern media, shifting from the system of visual representation to the operation of spatial and environmental management. This conceptual shift from the window to the wall is also a move away from a perspective-centered conceptualization of modernity toward a surface-oriented configuration of environmental management, mobility control, and the social political demarcation. And I want to start by arguing the meaning of the wall as a metaphorical concept can be explored by starting with the two very basic structural conditions of wall. There's a wall as an enclosing barrier and as a displaying surface. As a barrier, the wall is a controlling apparatus that not simply divide, but also regulate passages and produce leverage. It concentrates power to those who build, own, and manage the wall. By concentrating the power, wall as a barrier does tend to be a polarizing structure, polarizing spaces between inside and outside, center and edge, earth with them. The wall thus belongs to what Bernard Stiegler described as a cultural technique of dwelling that operates through making distinctions. However, unlike other distinction-making devices such as the door or the window that you can open or close, the wall as a barrier is more absolute. The wall is to be obeyed. The symbolic of the wall as a barrier therefore tends to be very political. As a political symbol, the wall often staged as a performance or spectacle. is tied to the other conditioned wall as a displaying surface. At the surface, the wall is a message board to be inscribed with symbols, words, and picture. Writing on the wall is one of the most ancient modes of communication and documentation. The surface condition makes the wall a displaying screen, a visual and a tangible environment for representation. As a screening surface, the wall is also an asymmetrical device that distinguishes between the front and back, between what is on the wall and what is behind, what is revealed and what is concealed. The wall's surface condition of display, therefore, is inherently tied to its barrier condition of enclosure. So I would argue that the barrier and the surface are very two fundamental organizational conditions of wall that always operate simultaneously. A wall is always both a barrier and a surface, and it is asymmetrical in the contradictory structure. As a barrier, it is rigid, constraining, and tend to be suppressive. As a surface, however, it can be light, enabling, and transformative. A wall is its contradictory object and a concept full of tensions. So my main task today is to trace configuration of this two conditioned wall, which is simultaneously a barrier that encloses the territory community, as well as the surface that display feelings of powers. And I want to trace these two conditions and how they reconfigure differently through the material and conceptual formation of two, what I believe to be the archetypal walls in Chinese history, which is Cheng, means city, walled city, and the Ping, which refers to wall screens. I want to argue it's not like a Cheng is the barrier or Ping is the surface, but rather both of them is the simultaneous two condition, but reconfigured differently through different historically contingent situations. So in their material conceptual formations, Cheng and the Ping each serve as a powerful primal scenes for conceptualization of walls as media. So I borrowed the term primal scene from Francisco Casati's essay Primal Screen, which is to say the primal scene is not simply an origin or prototype, but it's rather what we retrospectively perceive as explanation for the emergence of dispositive and operational assemblage that define a media system as a set of aesthetic and cultural conventions with material structural, symbolic meaning, and the social political implications. Let me start with Cheng, the city. In Chinese language, the word wall can be translated either Qiang or Cheng. So Qiang often refers to a domestic wall in your house. Its pictographic elements emphasize it as architectural components and the technology of wall building. So it's why it's firewall. Cheng, on the other hand, rather highlights the social, cultural, and political function of wall in making a public space and a community. Often referring to a city wall or a city itself, the term Cheng emphasizes the historical, material, and conceptual overlap between the wall and the city. As the city is often developed at building a wall to carve its boundary, to define its territory, and to enclose a space for people's habitation. Therefore, the word Cheng is defined by the function of wall to generate the community through spatial enclosure. That's why the earliest definition of Cheng in the dictionary 2,000 years ago defined it as, quote, to hold and accommodate people. The archaeological overlap between the city and the wall in the material history of Cheng can be seen in the urban geography of many Chinese cities, such as the city of Beijing, an urban space that is structured and enclosed by a layer of the circular walls. This circular design for Beijing, enclosed by layers of walls, was developed in the Ming Dynasty and lasts till today. So this is a map of today's Beijing, where layers of circular walls were simply replaced by circular roads, highways, and subway that are literally named the first ring, second ring, the third ring. So if we go to Beijing, basically it's the city of layers of rings. But more importantly, in Chinese history, the famous Cheng is no other than the Great Wall, Changcheng, which literally means the long wall city. Though often imagined as a grandeur spectacle that marks the extensive northern border of the expansive territory of ancient China Empire, Changcheng, in fact, is less a continuous border wall despite its names, but rather assemblage of fragmented defense fortresses connecting series of border towns and cities. The cultural history of Changcheng, the Great Wall, marks a decisive moment in the material and the conceptual history of Cheng, because the formation of the Great Wall as both a material border and a cultural symbol of China Empire marks the pivotal transformation of Cheng as a concept, as a meaning transformed from the social cultural expression of a community to a political symbol of imperial sovereignty, from a boundary of a long city that can be lived to a surface of a great screen that displays nothing but the power of empire. So this transformation in the meaning and the significance of Cheng is manifested by the changing discourse of many different stories of a legendary figure called Meng Jiang or Lady Meng Jiang, who is famously told to have brought down the Great Wall with her crying tear of sorrow for losing her husband at the war. The legend of Meng Jiang is at the center of the political and cultural imagination of the Great Wall. So this legend or legendary or mythical story goes like this. Lady Meng Jiang's husband, Qi Liang, is a soldier in the Qin dynasty who was sent to the border as a forced labor to build the Great Wall. Meng Jiang followed her husband to the construction site of the wall, only to learn of his tragic death. Mourning for the death of her husband, Meng Jiang weeps so sadly. Her sorrow tears allegedly caused the collapse of the wall. It's about women bringing down a wall. So despite being one of the most iconic figures in the cultural history of the Great Wall, the story of Meng Jiang, however, was not formulated as what is commonly known today until Tang Dynasty, which is like the 9th century, almost like 1,000 years after the Great Wall was initially built. In the earlier historical traces of this legendary woman, her story actually did not emerge in the Qin dynasty when the wall was first built by China's first emperor as a symbol of imperial sovereignty, but rather instead, this earlier story dated back to the pre-Qin period of the warring state in the 5th century BC, when China was still composed of many different city-states before being united as a single empire. So therefore, the story of the lady predated the construction of the Great Wall. And more conspicuously, in the earliest historical account of this lady who mourned the death of her husband, there was no wall at all, but instead the story took place on the road. So the story is like this. Xi Liang's wife met the Duke on the road and requested a proper ceremony from the Lord to mourn the death of her husband who was killed in battle. This request, of course, is political in nature, as it is asking the political authority to recognize the sacrifice of the citizen who dies to defend the city. This political request, however, originally had nothing to do with the wall. So what was added later? The wall was introduced to the story 300 years later in the 1st century BC by scholar Liu Xiang in the Han Dynasty. But the wall is not the Great Wall, however, it is simply Cheng, the city wall. So in Liu Xiang's version, there's a second half of the story after the Duke already granted the woman's request of a proper ceremony of the husband. So after that, Qi Liang's wife continued mourning for that husband publicly by crying at the Cheng, the city wall. And her wailing was so moving that it caused the wall to collapse. So you can see there's a lot of differences between the two stories. And the discrepancy between these two versions is a subject of constant debates by Chinese scholars and historians. And the key question is, why adding the second part, the Act 2, to the story? Because the ruler has already granted her request by completing a public ceremony. Why did the lady continue her public display of mourning? What's the point? What is the purpose of such action of crying at the wall? What is the meaning of the wall and its symbolic collapse at the end? In fact, the writer Liu Xiang gave a hint of why he adding an Act 2 to the story. But in his later book called The Biography of Exemplary Woman, which also include the story of this legendary lady with almost exactly the same narrative, but with one tiny exceptional difference, that in this another version, there is an audience. So in this version, there is notion of passerbys who were moved to tears by the lady crying at the wall. So this notion of audience, the people surrounding the wall, suggests that the lady was not so much crying to the wall as she was crying to the residents of the city, the fellow members of the community. Cheng, which is defined as the accommodation of the people, is thus the representation of the community of the city. The public performance of crying at the wall, therefore, is more social than political, because the political action is already completed in the first half of the story when the lady confronted political authority on the road. So the second part of the story of the lady's activity is a social request for communal solidarity, asking the fellow residents to share her sorrow of loss. So in this social request, there are two key elements. The first is action, ku, which is not simply crying, but is a ritual performance of mourning in folk tradition. And the second is the location where this action takes place, cheng, the city wall, which has three functions. First, as a public site of social gathering, there's a passerbys. Second, as a public space, it is a displaying screen for staging a performance, like a screen in cinema or theater. Third, as a representation of the city itself, cheng is a sign of social cohesion of the community. Crying to the wall is crying to the community. So combining these two elements, the story of the lady crying on the wall suggests a significant social function of cheng as public site for displaying communal rituals and solidarity, because the wall symbolizes social cohesion, integrity of the city as a community by serving not only as a boundary of territory, but also as accommodation and protection of its population. The symbolic collapse of the wall thus can be read as a moral fable regarding the ethics of the communal solidarity and the unity. If we cannot share the sorrow and the loss of one of our members, the community may well collapse like the wall. So therefore, in this pre-imperial history of China, the meaning of cheng, or city, is more social than political. It is a symbolic site of public display for communal support and protection. It signifies the social formation of the city as a community. Only after the building of the Great Wall, at the dawn of China's first empire, that the meaning of cheng transformed dramatically from the social cohesion of the community to the political power of imperial sovereignty. And the story of Lady Meng Jiang also transformed dramatically from a moral fable about public ritual and communal solidarity to a popular myth about folk antagonism and defiance against the sovereign. This transformation suggests the war is not inherently political, as meaning is historically contingent. This changing story of Meng Jiang is the conceptual transformation of cheng from the community to the sovereignty, from the social to the political, echoes the contemporary Greek tragedy of Antigone, which is written in a very similar time of the 5th century BC. And it's a very famous story, by the way. Antigone is one of the 4 children of Ophir. Her brother dies in the war fighting against the ruler of the city in the failed effort to take control of the power. Antigone wants to bring her brother's dead body inside the city wall for proper burial, but her uncle, the ruler of the city, forbid her from doing so because her brother dies as the enemy of the city states that should be punished by the denial of a communal mourning. So for a lot of Western thinkers who talk about this story from Aristotle to Hegel, the story of Antigone is a significant text that is often read as allegory for the formation of the concept of polis. It's a political entity that is founded on the social relation of communal kinship, but replaces with state laws. But I think what is often overlooked in the story is the significance of the wall as a symbolic site to the foundation of a polis, because it is the wall that defines not only the physical territory of the polis, but also its social and political integrity. Who is inside or outside the wall defines who is our member or enemy. So thus Antigone is forbidden from taking her brother's body inside the wall, and the failing to obey will be punished by being killed at the wall. The wall is a site of both public recognition and the punishment. As the story Eldon argues, the story of Antigone tells us the relation between a walled territory and the community living in it. He says, the quote, "The polis must be understood in the dual sense as a site where the action takes place and as the people who live there," end quote. So therefore, both the territory of the site and the integrity of the population have to be protected by the wall. So in both this Chinese legend of Meng Jiang and the Greek tragedy of Antigone, the walled city signified the formation of a polis in social and political means. They also highlight the gender of women as a significant figure, as a performer, negotiator vis-a-vis the wall's supposed absoluteness. More importantly, this story signifies that emphasize that the symbolic function of a cheng as a social political representation of the city lies in its dual status as both a boundary device and a surface of public display. As Carlos Rogers argued in his study of the Great Wall, the wall's power lies in the status as a figurative screen onto which a variety of meanings and beliefs can be projected. It is quality of being a pure surface that provides a foundation for the wall's conceptual unity and historical continuity and the code. So, and its status of being a pure surface does point to another genealogy of the wall that is associated with not the city, but rather the screen, that is ping. So the Chinese word ping, translated as screen, referring to an architectural object that is simultaneously a system of visual display and the device of spatial division. The object highlights the deeply rooted connection and the tension between closure and the display that are embedded in the concept of screen, which has to be understood through the screen's material and functional overlap with the wall. The notion of the screen, which has historically been referred to as shield or a filter in the Western context before it became an optical device, has increasingly been theorized in media study for its spatial and the environmental aspect. The wall, one of the foundational elements in the spatial construction of human environment, is thus increasingly recognized in media studies as a crucial component in both the genealogy and archaeology of the screen. However, despite the recognition that the screen's optical dimension is always connected with the spatial configuration often categorized as either historical precursor or structural preset of an optical screen. So this genealogical relation is highlighted by the recurrent notion of becoming that suggests a transformative process from a spatial screen to an optical screen. That is, a wall has to become a screen by offering itself as a pictorial surface that displays something and by turning into an information surface. Such a scenario of a wall becoming screen, however, gesture toward a fixed genealogical direction that positions the optical screen as the destiny or the end goal toward a visual representation system. What if the spatial arrangement is not to be assembled into a visual system, but instead the visual system is operated as such in order to construct and organize a visible and navigable space? In fact, a wall does not become a screen, it is a screen, because it's both display and the blocks, the two core functions of the screen. The wall has to display itself so that it can be seen and perceived as a blocking device. In other words, the wall's displaying function of a screening is integral to the spatial function of walling, because in order for the wall to control our space, it has to be first seen and perceived as such. The wall screen does constitute a non-information surface that displays nothing by itself. It announces its own existence and displays its own function and operation as spatial arrangement. Ping is precisely such a wall screen. Its self-displaying function as a visual device is integral to the structural function as a spatial device, that is a movable wall. Dated to the 3rd century BC, the term ping refers to a material and a cultural system that is not so much a medium of visual representation than a framework whose basic function is to distinguish space. Compared with its primary function as a spatial object, ping's representational function for image bearing came both secondary and historical later. First appearing as object of imperial symbol to be placed in royal rituals, then domesticated as a piece of household furniture, ping was later incorporated as a crucial visual element into the artistic convention of Chinese painting as a compositional device to construct a pictorial space. In all these 3 renditions, the screen often have some image on them. However, the representational function as a painted screen did not seem to be the primary concern. As a compositional elements, the screen were often shown as displaying nothing other than themselves. It is the screen's self-displaying function that enabled it to function as a significant pictorial sign in Chinese artistic tradition of constructing a pictorial space of painting. As a non-information surface that displays mainly itself, the chief function of screen is a structural, not representational. As a structural element in Chinese visual culture, the self-displaying function of a ping as a wall screen constitute a spatial sign that is often political, because they frame and construct a symbolic space that is divided in hierarchical, man versus woman, master versus servants, emperor and his subjects. The most prominent use of ping as a political sign is its positioning behind the emperor in the royal court, encircling and securing the position of the emperor as absolute master that dominated the space. The wall screen carved out the symbolic power center for the emperor by establishing a spatial divide between the emperor and his subjects. The power relation of royal authority is also established by the visual relation between seeing and being seen. Situating at his back, the screen does not represent the image for the emperor to see as the viewing subject, but instead, both emperor and the screen are displaying themselves as a spectacle that have to be seen by the others. Enforcing a gaze upon themselves, the screen and the emperor forbid any view behind or beyond them, like a wall that blocks our vision by confronting us with the view of the wall itself. Facing the viewer, the emperor and the screen merge into each other, appearing in unison to confront and control the emperor's subjects. The wall screen is thus an extension of the emperor, who is embodiment of the imperial sovereignty. If the wall is a screen that displays itself, then sovereignty is the power that announces itself. It is immanent in the self-evident because it is secret. Through spatial division and enclosure, the wall screen behind and encircling the emperor generate the sacred space for the sovereign and him only, and announcing him as a God-given master, the absolute sovereign. In her insightful analysis of the relation between border wall and political sovereignty, Wendy Brown highlights the deeply rooted relation between sovereignty, theology, and the spatial arrangement. Brown suggests that the sovereignty is a peculiar border concept. The absolute yet bounded condition of sovereign power is rooted in its theological foundation on spatial containment. Enclosure lies at the origin of the sacred. Imagine as a spatial order from the God, sovereignty is thus founded in the sacred dimension of spatial enclosure. The wall, which are the spatial divides that generate and enforce such enclosure, function as iconography of the sacred power of sovereignty. Staging and signifying the secret space for the sovereign, the wall is thus the screen that displays itself as a spectacle of the sovereign. It is the sovereign power's extension and performance. The performative and theatrical dimension are highlighted by the central display of ping as a significant object in royal rituals in China's imperial history, prominently positioned behind emperor when he performed a court ceremony to give an audience to his subject. The theological relation between sovereignty and the spatial closure, which has been historically performed by the stage arrangement between the emperor and his ping, serve as a primal scene for its modern-day rendition on China's Great Firewall. A digital wall screen, whose blocking effects is described as ping bi, using the ping as a wall screen. Borrowing its name from the iconic iconography of the Great Wall, Changcheng, and the technology of the firewall. The Great Firewall is a combination of both a Cheng and a Ping. By signifying the spatial enclosure with its dual signification of Cheng and Ping, the wall is displaying both a spectacle for the sovereign power as well as imagination of network community. So this is a title here, it displays the title of a book written by Fang Bingxing, who is the head engineering of the Great Firewall. They call him the father of the Great Firewall. And the book titles emphasize the notion of both the sovereignty and community in relation to the Great Firewall. I want to quickly conclude by this quoting Henry LeBroux, who says, quote, "Wall serve to define both the screen and the wall serve to define both the seen and obscene, which is asymmetrical and ambiguous space that is a sort of a face and a sort of facade." So I think by emphasizing these two different conceptual history of war, what I want to ask is to think the possibility to discover the surface tension of these two different configurations and to explore the way in which a facade can be overturned, the front turned to the back, favor tend to fervor. And I want to just quickly show several arts, I think, kind of projecting the possibility of returning and problematizing the configuration of both Cheng and the Ping by a Chinese artist Miao Ying, who did in her web arts so-called called Land Love Poem, which explored the displaying surface of the Ping and the on the firewall, as well as the encircling function of a Cheng in its sort of spatial configuration. So I want to just show several pictures and end here. Thank you.